alum. She is a producer who tells stories about the overlooked histories of the world. Before joining the New York Times Opinion Audio team as a development producer, she came through WNYC Studios, where she was on the launch and production team of Come Through, a series of 15 conversations about race in America. Before that, she worked on podcasts, including The Clearing, Reply All, and The Gist. As an Atlas Obscura editorial and events fellow, she investigated, I'm reading the bio and telling you what I did as if I did it, investigated dozens of stories about overlooked places, foods, and people. And a side note, I'm currently propping up my computer screen on the hardcover copy of Atlas Obscura, my favorite book. She's reported on historical stories such as The Incredible Tale of Kathy Williams, the first documented African-American woman to serve in the US Army, and ones about the future, such as Nepal's quest to become a great Olympic ski nation. In 2019, she won the Catapult Black History Writer Scholarship and the International Women's Media Fund Kim Wall Memorial Reporting Grant. Her reporting took her to Lijiang in southwest China, where she produced a piece for the BBC on the minority Moso and a folk musician trying to preserve the Moso's endangered language. Before her life as a journalist, Christina lived in Tokyo for a year, studied at Waseda University, and later interned at Fuji TV in DC. She also lived in Kathmandu for a year as a 2016-17 Princeton in Asia Fellow at World Education Nepal. While there, she worked in the communications department to create media strategies for the INGO's education and development programming. She also helped to document human trafficking, girls' education, and post-earthquake stories through film, photography, and text. Catherine St. Louis is a class of 92 alumna and the senior editor at Neon Hum Media, a podcast production company. She spent 18 years at the New York Times as a reporter and editor, but she left in 2017 to pursue a second career. First, she was a producer and host and made a podcast about voting rights called Shut Out. It won a front page award from the Newswomen's Club of New York. Then she found her calling in editing podcasts. She joined Neon Hum in 2018 and has since edited more than 10 limited run podcasts, such as Spectacle, Fake Priest, The Thing About Pam, and Infamous. And there was a little bit more here, but I'm going to stop there and let Catherine share. So I'd like to just sort of start the evening, and we'll kick off with you, Christina. From how did you get to Williston, and how did you get from Williston to where you are now?
Good question. I was just looking at a couple of my former applications that are in my closet. And a good part of me getting to Williston is my mom and her coming from a strong education background and also a family of other boarding school Ghanaians, very small group of us on Long Island. So I was very familiar. My mom had taken me to boarding school tours when I was 2 years old. She was that type of parent. So yeah, that's definitely how I got into Williston. And then at Williston, I was really involved in a lot of arts and a lot of the multicultural student associations and unions that we had here. And so I was really active in creating a space for like Black and Brown folks. And I also did a lot of a cappella, and I was in chorus, I did children's theater, and I was in every musical I could be in. And I was also a really big nerd. Anything from Hayao Miyazaki movies to graphic novels, I was reading, watching, and consuming. So I kind of naturally gravitated to performance at Williston. But even though I had those interests, I didn't immediately see how that could translate into a career. So a big discovery point for me was when I went to college and I started hearing about podcasts. I'm like, oh, podcast, what was that? And I went to George Washington University and I listened to the Read. And then afterwards, when I graduated, Two Dope Queens. And so when I would commute to work, those are the things that would be the soundtrack to my life, to my commute as I was going to my corporate advertising job. And at a certain point, I realized I didn't want to be an advertising manager anymore because I didn't want to tell stories about products. I wanted to tell stories about people. And so I decided I needed a professional and personal reset. So a lot of the college studies in my background at the time was in international development with a focus on Africa and Asia. And so I applied for the Princeton Asia Fellowship, which is a 1-year early to mid-career work fellowship program open to anyone, which I really liked about the program. And I got selected, and I ended up working at a international nonprofit in Nepal doing communications work. And though I had been listening to podcasts even more in Nepal, and for many, many years at that time, I started getting really curious about the people who were making them. Partly because I was thinking about a new direction for myself. And so I actually learned a lot about these people from an unexpected place, Twitter. So I found out about all these makers who I didn't know that they were former lawyers. I didn't know that they were former social workers, had completely different careers before they got into audio, before they got into radio or podcasting. And I think most importantly, they look like me. And so when I had this revelation about podcasting, I started using my Princeton Asia network to find people in media. And I had a travel blog at the time. And so I used a lot of my writing samples in applications. So you can do that. And through that, I ended up at Atlas Obscura. And that was kind of my first really major journalism job after college. And I kind of went to podcasting from there. So that was a little bit of my transition from Williston to media and the audio space.
Hey. So Williston, I got to Williston because my older brother went there. My older brother went there. My younger sister went there. I was a 6th-year senior. So that means I went there in the 7th grade. It was like a lifer. And I know Christina says that she was a nerd. Like I truly was a nerd. Like I had like buck teeth and I was like very awkward, but I was extremely good at school. And also I did some sports. So I was a big track star and cross country runner and swimmer. I also dabbled in theater and did some photography. But I kind of was like super serious about studying. Like, I'm not going to lie. I was a little Tracy Flick about it. So that was Williston. And then I went to Princeton, and then I went to graduate school. And halfway through graduate school, I realized I did not want to be a professor. I wanted to try out journalism. And so, long story short, ended up at the New York Times on the early side. And instead of being a reporter at first, weirdly, I got into editing first. And it's kind of a long story, but it basically took somebody plucking me out of a bunch of sort of entry-level folks and saying, like, you keep structuring stories, like you keep thinking about what comes first or how best to tell stories, and you are an editor. And I was like, I'm a what? But it turns out this guy was right, and I was an editor. And so he kind of fostered that in me. And I did end up going to reporting after I had my kid. I ended up reporting. I was a health reporter forever. And by the time I left the Times in 2017, I had been doing health reporting and had like 5 different beats in terms of health reporting. But I left, to be totally honest, because I was, I mean, it sounds crazy, but I was bored. Like, I just thought to myself, you know, if I die tomorrow, they're going to be like, she wrote really competent health reporting and she barely got errors. And wow, she could really spin a CDC conference, you know? And I just thought, really? And I started thinking about like, what could be things that only I could do. And there were 2 things that were on that list. One was telling the kind of audio stories I wanted to tell. And the second one was writing a book about family estrangement when family members stopped talking to one another. So I went and left the Times and pursued those 2 dreams, and one of them worked out. Guess which one? So I was a podcast producer And Christina and I will get into the difference between producers and editors, but basically I became an editor because I realized that I had this weird habit when I was still at the Times. For 3 years, I kept, every time I listened to a podcast, I would like write down all the beats of the story and be thinking about structure and how people started stories, or how they were kind of like where they would put the surprises or the cliffhangers. And I could never really stop doing that. I mean, I was storyboarding entire seasons of podcasts for fun. And finally, my husband was like, this kind of seems like a job. Like, it's like a job. It seems like work, what you're doing. And I was like, do you think it could be? And of course, by then the audio industry had exploded and there were a ton of people wanting podcasts, and this was a job. And it turned out I wasn't half bad at it. So I got a job being a podcast editor. That's the short story.
So that's amazing, both of your stories. And I think that you two have talked a little bit, and you have a way that you can kind of step us through a little bit about the business of audio. So I'll just turn it back over to you to talk about that.
Yeah, the business, the biz. I think one of the things that's important to understand is that there are so many different podcasts and genres in it. So when it comes to like development, it's a team-wide sport. It's not an individual sport. And even when you are an individual producer, you always have a team of people who are listening and like growing with you. And so there are fiction podcasts, there are like news podcasts like The Daily, there are journalism storytelling ones like This American Life, mystery, true crime, and other subgenres within true crime. So it's kind of useful to sometimes think about podcasts and the diversity of the content like TV and movies. And also think about how it's made by big groups of people. So going back to Catherine, your point about producers, they're the ones that are really helping to find different people. If it's like an interview show, find a guest, helping to cut the tape, which is like the recording that you get, and like shaping it into an interview or a narrative. Sometimes they act as reporters as well when they're like finding stories. So producers can be a big, big, big amorphous term, but they are usually the people who are helping that foundation. And then the editors look at from a bird's eye view of like shaping a script, the story, interview questions, etc. Like a lot of what Catherine is talking about is really thinking about structure and how it can be storyboarded. And then you have hosts, the people who are the talent sometimes that can be the producer, but it is usually someone who has like a strong POV guiding the show and guiding the stories, and then guests. And then I think most importantly, our unsung heroes are audio engineers who mix a lot of the songs and the conversations together. So when you are listening to The Daily and it's so like clean and crisp, that's a lot of audio engineers like going in and fine tuning and making sure everything is really spick and span. And then sometimes when you have the benefit of working at a lot of different news organizations or like production teams, you might have a marketing and social media arm, which is really nice. So you don't have to focus on that. So I wanted to like overlay like what the industry is, and in terms of just how I've worked on a couple of shows, but I'm gonna talk about Come Through, which is a series at WNYC that was about 15 conversations about race in America. And so I was an associate producer, which means I was the closest one to tape, which means you are, again, first person, like building the foundation. And how it came up as an idea was my host, Rebecca Carroll, wanted to really focus on 15 conversations about race. And so that was the pitch, that was the filter for the show. And then we brainstormed in the first 2 months that we had, working with an editor, working with Rebecca, the host, executive producer, to really figure out like, what is our unique viewpoint and angle for the show, and what would be the topic overall, and then deciding the topic for each conversations. Would it be sports? Would it be about gender, allyship. And once we figure that out, then you can kind of slot in the types of guests you want for that specific conversation. So celebrities or writers. For our religion episode, we had Bishop T.D. Jakes, for example. And once you start to get those guests, you have to prep and research the topics and the questions. And that's what I did a lot. For Bishop T.D. Jakes, I had like a 15-page prep doc of like who he is, important interviews that relate to like faith and religion and politics. So crafting the interview questions. And then once you get into the recording, the stuff that you all hear as a final product, a lot of it is like me in the booth and then Rebecca as the host being like, okay, so if I walk into a room and into a church and I tell you I don't believe in God, what would you say? And Bishop T.D. Jakes being like, well, and I'm a pastor, so and I'm in the booth kind of like monitoring each question. And so it's kind of guiding the focus. And then the kind of last parts of it is me cutting the tape. So cutting meaning like I am actually just like taking chunks of this hour-and-a-half interview and condensing it into something that's like 20 to 30 minutes. And an editor coming in and giving notes and telling me, okay, this is where it can be cleaned up. This can be structured this way. And once that's all done, you can package it together with like a marketing team if you do have that. Usually that was also on me at WNYC. But yeah, that is a little bit about kind of the process and also kind of my experience making a show at Come Through.
So I work for a podcast production company. So it's the kind of thing I think growing up, we all realized, there are all sorts of local NPR stations, and some of them like WNYC have an arm that make podcasts, right? But the company I work for, Neon Hum, we only do podcasts, and we're basically the place you go when you want to make a prestige podcast. So say you're a Dateline NBC, or you're Film Nation, or you are a nonprofit and you don't know how to make an audio story. You reach out to us and we will make it with you. So we do a lot of for-hire work. But in the last year, we've started to do original work as well, which is a podcast that's like only made for us, by us. It's kind of great and huge creative freedom. And we have that freedom now because we got into a joint venture with Sony Music, and they basically funded us. They took a bet on us and said, hey, I bet if we give these folks a certain amount of money, they will create podcasts that lots of people want to listen to. So there's kind of two arms. So in the for-hire arm, one of the podcasts we made was this podcast called Murder on the Towpath. It was hosted by Soledad O'Brien, and Film Nation was the partner. So Film Nation, obviously they usually make movies. But in this case, they felt like this should be a podcast first. They came to us with the idea and some research done. And then basically we put together a team. There's an editor, a producer, an associate producer, myself, and then also a supervising producer. And we all sort of sat down. The first step is like sitting down and making an outline and trying to figure out, like, of the 8 episodes, like, how do we want this story to work? Like, what do we want to be in the first episode? Personally, as an editor, I think you have to grab people's attention. You have to grab it quickly. And then like by the end of the first episode, if someone doesn't hit subscribe, they never will. So the story was a story of a white woman who was murdered on a towpath in Georgetown. She was a socialite. She was an artist. She was a mother. She was many things. And she was also really connected, like with the CIA and a whole bunch of other kind of government folk. She was murdered on the towpath in 1964, and a Black man was accused of killing her, and a Black woman named Debbie Roundtree basically was his lawyer. So think about that. Like in the 1960s, an African-American woman was his lawyer. and not to spoil anything, she got him off and he did not go to jail for a crime he didn't commit. So it's the story of these. Ultimately, we figured out that it was really the story of these two women that never met, whose paths crossed in this fateful day where one of them died and the other one came to kind of make sure a man who was accused of this murder wouldn't go down for it. It was a really hard story to tell, namely because like both of the women couldn't talk to us. Devi, unfortunately, had died a year and a half before we got the assignment to make the podcast. And of course, Mary Meyer had died that day on the towpath. So it was looking at like all of the elements of the story and trying to figure out, how do you tell a story like that? That's like an ensemble kind of story where none of the characters meet. So we started looking at like other movies and comps of like things that like go on, like stories that unfold that way in satisfying ways, like Magnolia, right? Do you remember that movie? Like none of the characters meet and like they're all doing their lives, and then at the end you understand how they all fit together. We kind of like stole a page from that. We had some great cliffhangers to work with, and we knew the cliffhanger for the first episode had to be that Mary Myers, the white woman who was a socialite, who was a painter, who died that day on the towpath, she had had an affair with a very prominent man. And then we just played archival tape of JFK's peace speech that everybody knows. And you're like, wait a second, what? And then we said, and that man, well, Soledad did, that man was JFK. And then everyone was like, subscribe, because you're like, what? How? So I'd like to think it worked to have that be the cliffhanger. But Christina's right. Podcasting is a team sport. That's the best part about it. Like I felt like reporting was much lonelier than podcasting is. Like it's fun to bounce ideas off people. It's fun to kind of always be thinking about stories in communion with others. So yeah, like that's one of the best parts of being in podcasting.
So we have questions that people have come in, but sent in. But before we get to specific questions, let me ask you if you would each kind of give a little mini version of what's your typical day like. Are you working on multiple projects? Are you? It's COVID, so you're sitting at home. Are you on endless Zoom calls with teams of people? And if it's not COVID, are you in conference rooms with teams of people? What's a typical day in the life of a producer and an editor look like?
So when you said endless Zoom calls, that spoke to me. That was my day today. But it was an eventful day because in my development producer phase right now, I am working on 3 different stories at different degrees of completion. And so my day is a lot of talking to people, reaching out to different editors within the New York Times opinion desk, and there's different departments for like world and different departments for science, and reaching out to them and seeing their stories. And it's a lot of reading. It's a lot of reading different types of opinion articles that have gone out, or something outside of the New York Times that I'm really interested in. I will sometimes in the mornings look at an RSS feed called Feedly, and I have set it to different filters so that I can see what's happening outside of the world as well, because I'm interested in a lot of international stories. So that's a way where I can track stories sometimes before the New York Times picks it up, sometimes a week or 2 before, and then I will like call people up and see if they're like would be good to interview. So there's that part of it. There's also kind of in my afternoons where my team and I will have edits, meaning we will have a piece of a story that's in, say, the first draft, and we'll listen together and then give notes on what's working, what's not, where are people bored, where are people happy, where are people confused. And so a lot of that afternoon time is working on working stories in progress. And then in the evening, I'm I'm usually working on my own stories. And so if I have a lot of tape from an interview that was like 2 hours long, like right now I'm working on a story about speaking of tiger parents on tiger parents, that's 3 hours long. And now I have to cut it down to 45 minutes. So I work on that at night. So that's my day.
So I work for an LA based company, but I live in Brooklyn. So what's nice about my job is it doesn't really matter if COVID is on or not. I'm basically in my house. So really I wake up early and I try to outwake my kid. He gets up about 7:15 and I get up about 5. So I usually get like 2 hours of good solid work in from 5 to 7. Those hours are worth like 4 hours later. Like for whatever reason, when I've just come from just sleeping, if I turn to work, it's like I can see everything that I want to fix with the script, or I can listen to a mix and I immediately know what to do. And there's diminishing returns as the day goes on to that. So I'd say like the big thing work for super early. And then like, I take my kid to school and make them waffles, all that stuff. And then I'm back at my desk, let's say after working out. I always try to work out in the morning because none of the jokers in LA are up and they're not going to call me. And I got to get a workout in if I want to be sane. So usually I'm at my desk by like 9:45, let's say, and get a big chunk of work then done too before, again, anybody is really bothering me at like noon. So there's already like 4.5 hours of work, good work, like the good creative stuff done before it starts to be meeting after meeting after meeting. And I'm a senior editor at the company. So there's just a lot of meetings that, are not the creative work. But I do table reads like what Christina's talking about, where you all listen to 30 minutes of tape and figure out like what's working, what's not. Sometimes I'm in scripts, sometimes I'm in brainstorming meetings, brainstorming outlines. Right now I'm working on 3 podcasts. One is out that is a podcast about reality TV. Our 4th episode just came out yesterday. It's about The Bachelor and The Bachelorette. What's weird about this podcast is, yes, I know what you're thinking. Reality TV is garbage TV. It's trash. It says nothing about America. This podcast tries to argue that that's actually wrong, that reality TV is telling you something about America, it's telling you something about race, it's telling you something about gender. And if you're the kind of person who says, yeah, I've never watched the Kardashians, then I don't really think you can, you're really like in tune with what's happening in our world. Because Trump came out of reality TV and he kind of went somewhere and did a little damage. So we make the argument that like you think it's lowbrow, but I actually think it's worth paying attention to. And that reality TV might even be like an art form. So that's one of the podcasts I edit. The other one is about corruption, specifically corruption in LA. You'll have to wait for that one. It's just starting to be written. It's probably going to come out like this summer. And then the 3rd podcast is deep in development and isn't ready to be talked about yet. But I'm also starting a editor's boot camp where 8 people are going to learn what I know in order to try to change the audio industry and have more people from underrepresented groups be podcast editors. So I've been writing a ton of curriculum. Like I've written 5 weeks of curriculum and I have like 3 more weeks of curriculum to go. And the boot camp starts in 2.5 weeks. So a big chunk of my time and thought is going into those curriculum right now.
So I want to make sure that we have enough time for everyone who's on the call to sort of ask questions. And as I said, we have some that were pre-submitted. And I'm looking to try to see if the folks who submitted them are on the call, because it's always nice. What I'd like to do is we're going to take you guys off the big spotlight now and all come together in a group. And so that people can unmute and ask their questions of you. So what I'd ask people to do is if you do have a question, just put in the chat I have a question, and we'll work our way through so that you can have conversation with Christina and Catherine and find out what you want to know. So I will start with someone who I know is here. Connie Wilson, I saw you. If you want to unmute and ask your question.
Sure. What question did I submit ages ago? No. First of all, thank you both for sharing your journeys and everything. It's certainly wonderful to hear, and it's exhausting to hear what you both spend all day, all night doing. But how do you get through the fray? If you don't have a Soledad O'Brien, you don't have NPR, you don't have Film Nation, you don't have Dateline, you don't have any of those. How do you get through the fray if you are working on podcasts? How do you rise above, I guess? Thank you.
I can take a stab at that. I've worked as a freelancer all the way up until I started at the New York Times. So a lot of the times it will be a lot different, like you mentioned, to be an independent producer, or if you're doing it as like a hobbyist. But in general, the ways that have helped me being an independent producer is actually pitching stories to different organizations to get my feet wet. So I did a story with America's Test Kitchen, which is always looking for pitches. So like if you want to work on a food story or like find an intersection of something that you love, whether it's food and sports, they are looking for it. The podcast is called Proof. And so they help people who have never touched audio before. And so if that's like a way that you want to learn and also get paid for it, that's a way to kind of get your feet wet. And then if you're trying to do it by yourself, I think one of the ways that you can kind of try and build an audience is consistency. Is if you're making something, you have to be consistent, you have to put it out, and you can start a Patreon, and you can make your own like social media and marketing strategy, and like keep on keeping on it. So that I know is how a lot of people have worked on, at least from an independent or hobbyist side, have worked on building a lot of brand effect around their podcasts.
Thanks.
I feel that there are a bunch of questions you have to ask yourself if you're trying to start a podcast, and a lot of it is like development work. So I think you have to kind of try to figure out what your specific focus wants to be, what you will do that no other podcast does. Like, it's not enough to be like, hey, I want to talk about like family trauma, right? You have to figure out how you're different from all the other podcasts. And so there's kind of big questions to ask yourself, like what driving questions you want to get at. I mean, in the beginning, you kind of have to start with like, what format? Like, are you thinking like a chat show? Are you thinking like a show that will be like really short, but actually be narrative? So you'll be in scenes. But I mean, I can put some resources in the chat. Misha Youssef started something that's free, that's how to start a podcast. She made 2 on her own before she started her company. Kristen Miner wrote a book, How to Start a Podcast, is really good too. There are a bunch of resources online. Transom is another location that you can find a lot of information about how to take a topic to a story and how to build out a podcast. You definitely don't have to be Soledad O'Brien, but you are going to work your tail off. There's a massive misconception that podcasting is easy, and
Yes.
I really don't think it is.
No, not at all.
That sounds great. Well, I appreciate the feedback. I've worked with folks who are doing podcasts and trying to get through the fray of it all. And it's great just to hear what you all are doing. And so it's helpful. So thanks.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good transition into a question that was submitted ahead of time. And I don't see the person who submitted it here, but it's still a good question. Do you think it's realistic to take on a podcast venture in a committed but part-time fashion? And then, what do you feel are the pros and cons of going solo versus having a co-host?
I mean, I guess it really depends on how you define part-time and like what role you're going to play. Are you playing both host and producer, and you're also social media team? Because it's a lot of work, like Catherine has reiterated. And so you really have to know the scope of your show, like how much are you releasing, if this is going to be like a monthly, is this going to be weekly? So if you can establish something that you can do consistently, but also within your own time frame, that's something to consider. But like if you are trying to do something that's more like independent, I definitely know people who have done independent producing 3 times a week, and then that's full time, and then have like teaching jobs for like 2 days a week. So there is that frame. But again, it's really about defining what part-time is and like what the distinction between like a full hobby and actually committing to it as a almost like a part-time job. And then again, factoring a lot of time and what your show will be will all kind of contribute to how you can consider it to be part-time work.
I don't think there's any podcast that I would make that would be a part-time job. I think it would just be a full-time job on top of another job.
Right.
It's a lot of work. And I don't like to stay up late. I actually really like to go to bed at like 9:30. So, for me, I never, for example, could have worked at the New York Times and then on the side just like had a podcast. Even if it was just like a 2-way interview show, there's no way in hell. I like to prep too much. I like to find original ideas. I like to put some reporting in, and there's no way at the end of a long day reporting for the New York Times, I would have an iota of brain space to be like, let me turn my attention to like interviewing some more. There's just no way. I do know a few people like that, but they are incredibly gifted and they're incredibly rare and they don't sleep well. They're insomniacs, and that's just not me. So more power to you if you can do it. But I had to make it my work for it to get done.
Yeah, I hard agree with that. I do know those people, and I always wonder, how did you do that while writing like 5 columns? But here we are.
So along with that, because I think I hear a sort of a subtext of don't quit your day job to become a podcaster, but for people who are intrigued by this or who are in adjacent type of careers, what advice can you give for moving your way into the industry? How would you position yourself coming from another career um, to be hired by a podcasting company or by an audio company or a media company that does podcasting?
I mean, people never like it when they ask, like, how did you go from being a reporter and an editor at the New York Times, which is print, to being in podcasting? And they don't like the answer because it took like a ridiculous amount of work. And for me, I didn't really see it as work. I just was kind of low-key, crazily obsessed. But I basically started listening to so many podcasts. I built up a sense of what I like, what I don't, what works, how like these things get made. And it wasn't like I was just listening, I was listening and writing it all down. And I personally can do it that way. Like I also did not go to J school. I basically learned to write for the New York Times by reading the New York Times and deconstructing like the lead and being like, weird, this one starts with this story. I guess that's an anecdotal lead. Weird, this one starts with facts. I guess that's a different kind of lead. Really, truthfully, that's how I learned. Right. So maybe you can teach certain amount of these things yourself. You can teach yourself like what you like in a podcast. And I think that would be useful if you wanted to become an editor. But if you want to be a producer and you want to be the one with the mic, collecting the audio, trying to put together the story and knowing how you have to ask questions differently to get the right tape and audio, I think personally, I had to learn in person. So I took a couple of in-person classes in New York, and then I went to Transom Story Workshop out on Cape Cod for 9 weeks. And yeah, I was the oldest one there. I was like 42, and everybody was like a baby. Like I remember at one point, somebody turned to me and was like, wait, how could you have a 9-year-old? And I was like, how old do you think I am? It's just like, I don't know, like 31. And I was like, I'm not 31, dude. I'm 42. It's just like, why do you use dude if you're 42? Like, maybe I act young, but I'm actually old. So I'm like, I went and lived with basically people in their late 20s in order to learn audio. Like I left my kid, my husband, Brooklyn, and went to Cape Cod, like one of the whitest places in America. And it was just like, yeah, I'll just set up shop here for 9 weeks and pretend like I'm not Black. It was crazy, really, really crazy. But I felt very motivated, to want to make a change. So I feel like if you want to make the change to podcasting, it's not like it's not possible. But for me, I was very clear on the fact that this was a totally different language. Like right now, I work with a lot of print reporters that are writing their first like limited run podcast. And, whatever, they come at me with their Pulitzers. Like, oh, I had an award-winning book or two. And, oh, okay, fine, great. I love it. And what I say to them is, you can write in English. I am going to teach you how to write in Japanese. Like that's the leap. That's how big this leap is. So like the sooner you agree with me, the leap is that big to learn to write for the ear, the quicker I can get you there. And it usually takes most people about like 10 days. And then there are like certain people it takes about 4 weeks, but everybody comes around and it's like, okay, fine, just tell me what I need to know. You're like, okay, these are all the new rules. And by the end, they're great. But the more you kind of fight it and be like, this should be easy for me. I want a Pulitzer. This should be easy for me. I've written 4 books. It's like, leave it all behind, friend.
Right. I think it's also like important to remember that like any creative work is super hard, and to get good at it requires discipline and doing it over and over and over again. And that applies to podcasting. It is not something like you can just like pick up and do. Like the good stuff that you hear takes a lot of time and people and 8-hour like sessions. So that is something that you have to have that type of mindset when you are thinking about it. And I think for me, like getting into podcasting was really about finding, similar to Transom, I was able to do a program through the New York Mayor's office that was a free program. And it allowed me to learn about like the fundamentals of podcasting. And I was able to do that after work. So I worked at Atlas Obscura from like 9 to 6:30, and then went straight to the class from like 7 till 10 p.m. and then had my 2-hour commute to Long Island and then repeated that. So there is a lot of additional work, whether you are, and I also do this myself, is like listening and structuring things and doing a class. There's an amount of like self-teaching and other programs that are available to kind of help with that transition. From there, I just started doing a lot of either freelancing, so pitching to places, and also doing a lot of different internships. But I know that's not available for everyone else. So there are still different types of workshops and programs and fellowships that are out there for people who are like emerging into the podcasting game. So that's another thing to kind of look out for too. So that's a little bit about the transition. But again, discipline is the main theme of it all.
So to go back and pick up on something, Catherine, you mentioned there's a question in the chat about whether or not you can talk about some of those new rules, which I guess I heard as sort of saying the difference between writing for the eyes and writing for the ears. Oh, you're muted still.
So in print, you can have like big, long sentences that take up like 4 or 5 lines. There's not a radio story you'd want to listen to that has those long sentences. Like basically everything is the short sentence. Everything, like you just don't do clauses. So like it would not be like a loud Black woman, Catherine St. Louis. Like it just doesn't work in audio. You're like, what? The words are coming at me crazy. Catherine is loud. Catherine is Black. Catherine is a podcast editor. That you can say. Do you see how like it has like a cadence? So there are all sorts of like weird rules like that you never really notice when you listen to like NPR, but like they're just rules you have to kind of follow if you want people to understand it. Listening with your ears, like if you shut your eyes, and I often do this when I'm like listening to a story I'm editing that's in a rough draft stage, because like things get so confusing so quickly when you just listen and you don't have a script in front of you. So the other thing is clarity. At all times, you have to be much, much clearer than you are in print. And you don't use big highfalutin words like you might in print. Like if you don't say it out loud, don't put it in a script for a podcast. What are some other rules? Those are some of them. It's definitely like, I think when you think of like print reporters, you think, okay, everything that this person needs to know about this news story, they can get in my first 300 words. Like, it's like you just give away the whole barn. You're like, this is the reason why you need to listen to the story. This is the reason why it impacts you. These are the stakes. These are the stats. This is why you should care. And it's 300 words, right? Because you're assuming people are only going to read the first 300 words or what have you. If I did a podcast like that, it would be so boring. Like a podcast is closer to like, I don't know, whatever Netflix series that you love that like unfolds the way it unfolds. Like, and they only tell you what you need to know, and they keep you on the hook, and they keep you hungry for surprises, and they dole out the information in the order that will keep you on the edge of your seat so that you literally cannot stop listening and you must subscribe. That's what you're trying to do in podcasting. So it's like a whole different game. It's much closer to how you structure like television series than how you structure like a news story or even a news feature. It's a lot more fun.
And, you know, again, I'll encourage, I see some people are joining a little bit late, and we are just at the point in the evening where it's a conversation. So if you have any questions, you can either just jump into the chat and say, I have a question, and you can unmute and ask it yourself, or you can put your question into the chat. And Raphael, I know you had a question, but I'm kind of holding it to the end as our big final question, because I think a lot of people may want to weigh in. So just checking if anybody else has sort of a burning question about the creative side of podcasting, the business side of podcasting, the work of a producer, the work of an editor. What if you think that you could be, you know, you talked in the beginning about teamwork. What if you're a person who thinks, I have a great voice, I have an interesting story, I should be a podcast star, and you want to go look for a team to help make you a star? How does that happen?
Well, do you have money? Yes. Because I'm just saying, like, you know, you have to pay them.
Mm-hmm.
So like, that's why most people who like want to make a podcast in their closet have to get up to speed with actually being able to do it themselves, because you have to pay people for their work. It's just this weird quirk. People need to eat. So I think that like, if you have like a super great idea, I think if you want to pitch like a place like Neon Hum, the issue there is that you have to have a pretty distinctive idea for us to want to make it. So you have to have done all that great homework where you're like, well, I know there are a lot of podcasts about adoption, but here is my backstory. Or I know there aren't a lot of podcasts about Native American issues, but I happen to be the descendant of the Cherokee family that basically made the deal that led to the Trail of Tears. And I've basically spent all my life defending the decisions of my ancestors. And I want to make a podcast that deals with Native American issues today. Like, that podcast got greenlit. It is called This Land. Crooked greenlit it, and then I edited it at Neon Hum. And it's an absolutely beautiful podcast, but it's beautiful because Rebecca Nagel, the host and reporter for it, truly was like descended from the people who made a deal that led to the Trail of Tears. And so it's like, there's just so much emotion already built in to her backstory. So for her to tell stories in 2020 about her family, about a Supreme Court case that was going to decide whether or not half of Oklahoma was actually Native American and belonged to the Creek people, was very powerful and felt like the history wasn't the past, it was now. So she had a peg. She happened to be the descendants of this like Cherokee family that had made this like really tough decision. There was just so much there. So it's like, it's not enough to be like, I'm Catherine and I really like blueberries. It's more like, you know, like there needs to be some reason why you are telling the story of the blueberries.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Right. And like to give more context to that too, and like even as someone who is working within the Times, there are editors, again, who have years and years of experience pitching, but when they pitch me in audio, it's similar. It's like, I like blueberries and let's make a story out of it. And that's just not how it works. You have to have a very specific filter, a very specific viewpoint, and that is unique to you, that you can really speak on, that really no one else can, because that's what really makes it stand out. And so a lot of it is learning that, a lot of it is learning how to kind of think about what would work in sound too, as you're thinking of these stories, because again, yeah, sure, you can talk and talk a lot, but you need other sounds. We need to hear people walking, moving, going places. That's a big part of thinking about audio, because I mean, sure, you can have an interview, but like if you're trying to do these narrative stories, it's all 360. So that's a big part of when you're thinking about pitching, is like, where is the sound going to come into play?
So we have a couple more questions coming into the chat. So I'm going to go first, Deborah, and then Mackenzie. So can go ahead and unmute.
Oh, great. Thanks. This is really informative, and it's really fun to hear about your experience. And I'm podcasting now for over a year. I just celebrated a year and over 100 episodes. However, I'm in a different, I think, part, obviously part doing my own podcast. So I'm wondering if you could shed some insight maybe on the idea of sponsorship. It's not, a storytelling. Mine is more a personal brand and an interview show. So we're at the place right now where, we're looking to have the show sponsored, and we're putting our feelers out. But if you had any input or thoughts around that, that would be terrific. And this podcast is very specific. It's elevating the conversation around spirituality and sex. It's called The Real Undressed. If anybody wants to check it out, I think it's really quite fabulous. But I would love to know any insider thoughts you have about sponsorship.
I have to say, I know nothing about sponsorships for indie podcasts. But I believe that I attended a Work It festival, and Work It has, it's a women's podcast festival, and they put all of their sessions online. And I think there was a topic about exactly this. So if we continue, I will try to find it and put it in the chat.
Thank you. It's called Work It.
Work It.
Yeah, but Work It is WERK, because why not be cute?
Awesome.
Yeah, I wish I knew more. Having come from corporate advertising, I only know it from like the big branded side. And so for the independent networks, or just like indie podcasts, yeah, I'm not as familiar, but I think Work It, I think also going to audio conferences like Third Coast, they provide a lot of different resources to know how to think about sponsorship and think about who you want. And also if you want to do, I know a lot of a podcast called Who Weekly, which is about like celebrity news and who's the who and who's the them, thems being like people like Rihanna, they do Patreons, and the way that they think about their like modeling is they have exclusive content that is for people who pay to listen to their podcast. And so that's another way of, if you want to like build that type of subscription model where you're like, okay, you can get all this bonus content and no ads, you pay for our Patreon, that's something that you can consider too.
Got it. Okay. Thanks, ladies.
Mackenzie?
Hi, thank you guys for doing this. This is awesome. My question was more so, I think Deborah was a great transition. Thank you. For more of those interview-based podcasts, I'm not sitting down reporting a full story and telling a narrative, but maybe like you're sitting down and talking to someone who is more of a personality or whatever it may be. Would you say you kind of approach that differently from just doing a kind of more traditional interview where you're maybe sitting down to write a story on that person? Or what kind of tips would you have when you're starting that conversation, and what kind of research you put in ahead of time?
I mean, I would listen to a ton of interview podcasts of interviewers that you think get it right. I was pleasantly surprised when I listened to Dax Shepard's podcast. It does really well. And I was kind of like low-key annoyed by that because I was like, how dare he, right? But then I listened to his podcast with Ira Glass, right? Ira Glass of This American Life. And he got Ira Glass talking about threesomes. And I was like, okay, Dax, I see you. Because I'm like, Ira Glass is so awkward. Like, how did you get him talking about that topic? That's amazing. And Dax has this totally charming way of being like, shucks, Ira, you're the one who knows everything. Let me just throw another question out there. And as far as I can tell, they do not edit these podcasts. They're like all an hour and a half long. Ira was making fun of him, being like, you got to shorten this. This is not working. And then like Dax is like, last time I checked, I'm higher on the charts than you are. And I was like, so I think their team puts a lot of time and effort into thinking through what is the ground that we need to cover that's going to make someone like Ira feel like an expert, feel special, that people want to hear what he has to say. And then where can we just take this off the rails so that Catherine St. Louis's 2 years after listening to this podcast are like, oh my God, can you believe they did this? This is the added value. Like, sure, I listened to Ira Glass 1,000 times, but Dax took him somewhere new, right? So like there are some chat shows that you're listening to for that like charm and all of that. But then sometimes some chat shows go deep and go deep quick. So like there's this great podcast that Danny Shapiro does called Family Secrets. And as far as I can tell, it's about like past trauma. And she talks to a lot of book authors about their journey and what they've been through in their life. So I think she chooses book authors because they've already kind of processed their story and wrote it down so that an hour of listening to this person is actually really well thought out and digested, if that makes sense. But she still throws them curveballs so that you get good tape that's surprising in the moment. So again, like the theme, I guess, is that there's a certain amount of terrain where you're sort of in control as the interviewer. And then there's all these other questions that are like spaghetti you're throwing up against the wall to be like, I wonder what will happen if we ask this. I wonder if we go over here. Does that make sense? Cool.
Yeah, and in case you're looking also for shows where it might be you want a debate style, there are a lot of different shows. I will plug The Argument from the New York Times. They're rebranded podcasts where it's very chat based. They're interviewing people, but also just like talking about big arguments about whether it's about whether there should be a filibuster or what is the Free Britney campaign and like who agrees about it and who doesn't. So things like that, where you can kind of get a cadence of like how people argue, if that's something that you're interested in. There are a lot of podcasts about like friendships. And so if you're interested in doing something with like a friend, call your girlfriend. There's a lot of different archives from that show that kind of illustrate people who are really close to each other, but are able to still talk about something new and different each time. Yeah, I'm just trying to think of other good ones like that disarm people.
Well,
Yeah.
the legend, in my opinion,
Are we going to
is
say
Death,
the same
Sex,
one?
and Money.
Yes, yes, yes.
So Anna Sale is
Anna
like a
Sale.
total master. There are 2 interviews she's done that I'm still like, girl, how did you?
The
One
God.
of them was she talked to a shoplifter, and she talked to this shoplifter anonymously, but I swear I will put it in the chat. It is so fascinating. Anna just has this way of, she's just like completely not judgy, but she's asking all the questions that you want her to ask, but like in a non-judgy way that just keeps people talking. And this shoplifter gave it all away. I was like, why are you telling Anna this? That one. And then she also did an interview about young women who get paid to go on dates with older dudes. So it's not what you're thinking, but it's awfully close to what you're thinking. And the whole, you as a listener, you go in with this kind of thing like, oh, this young woman doesn't know what she's getting into. And I can't wait till Anna asks her all the question and puts her in her place, because that's societally what we think about this kind of transaction. And that's not what happens. This young woman knows exactly what she wants, why she's doing what she's doing, what she's using the money for. And basically what she exposes, all these daddies that come to her for dates are the ones who are confused. And I believe it as a middle-aged woman, that the middle-aged people are the confused ones. But it's fascinating because Anna doesn't come in with our preconceptions about someone who would want to go on dates where someone was like showering them with money and maybe expecting sex, right? That one's fascinating too.
So being conscious of the time, and also seeing that we have some people joining us a little bit late, I think if we can go another few minutes, if Christina and Catherine, it's okay with you. Catherine, I know we're edging up on your bedtime apparently, but one last call for questions in the chat, and then there's a lot of great information being put into the chat. So I hope everyone is seeing that. But barring any late breaking burning questions, I think we're gonna let Raphael close it out here by asking his question. And when you hear his question, which we'll ask Christina and Catherine to answer first, feel free to jump into the chat and add your own commentary to it, because it will make a great archive of this discussion.
I thoroughly enjoyed this, so thank you guys for doing this. As soon as I saw Christina's name, I had to join in and join the group. So thank you guys for doing this. My question was, what podcast is getting you guys through the pandemic? And it's a selfish question because I need more podcasts to listen to.
I can start. So the podcast that is getting me through is called The Bodega Boys. It's hosted by Jesus and Miro, the gods. They're 2 dudes from the Bronx who just kiki it up, talk about all things New York, sometimes not about things New York, anything that's hip hop. And they're just so funny. The way that their relationship is both online and just in this podcast, and also just their Showtime show, they just always imbue joy and life, and just there's a specificity too. Like they just know the Bronx so well, and I love just hearing them talk. And they also have like a little bit like in their intro, they do a little bit of like improv at the beginning with a lot of different sound effects. So if you're a fan of like old radio with like sound effects, they always have different ones that are basically like audio memes. That's how, like, that's the best way I can describe it, but that brings me so much joy. It is a little raunchy. So if you like that, I do sometimes. So it's fun. Another one I like is Scam Goddess. So if you like scams and you like comedy, Scam Goddess is going to be your friend. So each time, well, each episode is dedicated to like a different scam. So I think one recent scam that they did was a man who went to a casino and was trying to like scam a bunch of different people at the casino out of money. It did not work well. None of these ever really work well, but Lacey, the host, always tells it in a funny way, and there's usually like different comedians. So that's part of Conan O'Brien's network. Other things that are bringing me joy, other podcasts. I'm listening to a lot of fiction podcasts too, to kind of immerse myself out of a lot of things. So I started listening to this show called Mother Hacker from Gimlet, which is like this name, a hacker who also has to pay the bills and is scammed. There's a thread here, scams. And she's trying to like figure out how to get like $400,000 or some amount of money to this scammer who may or may not be real. And each episode is about like 10 minutes. It's really short, but it feels like you're listening to a movie. And so that's something that I like. It's just well produced. You feel like you are right in New York, or you feel like you are wherever she is. And so that's something that I've listened to, and it's really easy to kind of binge. So those are some of the podcasts I've been listening to.
So I don't feel like I really ever want to stop listening to tough stuff. I hate to be a disappointment. But one of the podcasts I loved recently was According to Need. I think it's like 5 or 6 parts. It's made by 99% Invisible. It was made by a woman named Katie Mingle. And it answers kind of some essential questions that I think we all have about homeless folks and the unhoused, and like why it is they remain unhoused in places that in cities that are trying to help. Like why is this such a persistent problem? She is such an incredible storyteller, and just her approach to every other human is just, it like fills me with joy, because she is just so filled with empathy and love. And I think the podcast is trying to humanize people that we see every day but don't really see. And I cannot, like, it's truly moving. And five episodes, I think. So that one I loved recently. Anything for Selena is a new podcast by WBUR. And it's a memoir podcast. And the host obviously really dug Selena like extremely bad, and for very personal reasons. So it's kind of Selena's story as well as the host's story. And it is so beautifully done, and just like a sonic ear bath. Like it's just so great, especially episode 2 that deals with one of my favorite topics, which is like difficult daddies. She kind of deals with her whole difficult daddy situation, and then she deals with Selena's difficult daddy situation, and it's like just a stunning story. So anything for Selena is that podcast. And then there's a new podcast by The Atlantic and WNYC called The Experiment. I have to say I didn't love the first 2, but the one that they recently put out was about Filipino nurses. And I think a major plague of our time is 500,000 Americans are dead, and we are all just so traumatized, we try not to think about it. And I do wonder when we're all going to wake up and realize what we have lost as a culture, as Americans. And this 30 minutes made me feel the way I think we're supposed to be feeling about all the Americans we lost. And it's a story about Filipino nurses and why so many of them died of COVID disproportionately. But also why they came to this country and their hopes and their dreams. And I gotta say, for a story that is about COVID, it is so full of joy. Like the tape of just these Filipino nurses like laughing and being in community. Like, I mean, I am probably super lonely, but like, I was just like, oh my God, this is so beautiful. So I'll put that in the chat too.
So this is great. We have a long list in the chat, and I'll make sure that when we post up the recording, we'll make sure that we post up top podcast recommendations from Wildcats, which I feel like should become a new monthly thing that we do. We are closing in on the end of the evening, so I want to thank Christina and Catherine both for being so generous with their time and with their expertise.